There's a lot I want to say about my recent experiences with job searching and also my experiences with working in social services, working in the mental health field. And I don't know if this is going to be the right time to talk about all of those things. But one thing I feel like I do need to talk about is that these systems are part of they play a role in perpetuating trauma, and I don't know how to say it. Um, I'm just going to take a step back and I'm just going to talk about how the system, from my experience, sees itself versus how the public sees the system. And the public, as we all know, I think they generally see the system as not working, but there's a naivete about what that actually means. And I think even though the public sees these systems as not working, there's still this hopefulness or this expectation that they're mostly getting it right. I don't think the general population really sits down and thinks about it enough to come to any like hard and fast conclusions. But I think they usually see the mental health system, the social service system, as mostly okay, functionally flawed, under budget, under staff, but that if only it had more money, if only it had more funding, all the problems would be fixed. We could just hire more experts. We could just um, fix it. And there's probably divisiveness among people around that too, of um, what they think the solution is. And I think there is still skepticism about, is the system fundamentally working for people? Do we just need to kind of upend the whole thing and change it? Um, the average person, though, I don't think they put much thought into this, and what little thought they do put into it, I think it's mostly informed by just general stereotypes and general ideas. They probably generally think like, they either think most therapists don't do much good, or they think therapists are the experts and we just need to hire more of them, and they probably don't think much beyond that. The way the system sees itself is in some ways similar. I think the way it sees itself is it just needs more funding, and then a lot of the problems will be fixed. I think it does have more awareness around um, systemic barriers and issues, and how different departments within government and different types of resources need to come together in a better way to work together to solve problems. So it sees more where those barriers are, and where um, different departments and different groups are siloed from each other, or there's not enough collaboration, not enough being on the same page. And there are attempts to fix that and bridge it. Um, but I think most of the frustration within the system comes either from feeling like there's lack of funding or there's lack of good, healthy coordination between different levels of government and different agencies. Part of the problem, though, is that these different groups searching for the right words to say this without sounding cliche. But there's this topic called trauma-informed care where there seems to be a lot of awareness around a lot of the people with mental health challenges and addiction challenges and related issues. It's part of it's coming from trauma, part of it is coming from systemic injustices, and to some degree for certain groups oppressive policies and treatment that certain people have faced, marginalization, things like that. There's more talk about that, but there's very little concrete awareness of what to do and what that actually means. I'll give an example. So trauma-informed care, it sounds nice, and it means well, and it's essentially rooted in just this basic idea that we need to treat people with severe and chronic mental health issues as human beings, which should be obvious and really shouldn't need to be said, but it apparently still does. That's really what it amounts to, and I think everything else that's said on top of it just kind of complicates it, but that's what it's about. Just treat them like human beings. And well, I guess the other half of that is ask yourself the question more, what happened to them instead of what's wrong with them. Like, take more of a curious approach of what happened in their life that contributed to where they are now, how they're acting now, how they're feeling. Don't just jump to this idea of there's something inherently wrong with them. So it's changing that perspective, and it's treating them like a human being, basically. And that kind of is a callback to the original client-centered, person-centered orientation that Carl Rogers put forth, and that research has shown these are some of the most important factors in therapy. But it seems to get kind of sidelined when it comes to people with more severe issues, like people who have extreme emotional dysregulation, people who are suicidal, people who hear voices or see things. Apparently, when you experience those things, all the nice client-centered and even trauma-informed principles kind of go out the window. And that sounds extreme, and I know a lot of people mean well, and part of this is due to burnout, high staff turnover, and yeah, in some cases, lack of funding. But it's not just that, and that's my point. So that's like half the problem right there, just saying something but not really meaning it, not really applying it, at least not to certain types of people, and honestly not really applying it as a whole too, in a sense. But there are attempts to do it, and I do recognize that that is more of a thing, and it's a good thing in a lot of ways to be more concerned about how can we avoid re-traumatizing people, and even just the fact of even considering a person's trauma and life experiences and how those shaped them and played a role in their current experience and their current behaviors. and then learning how to work with that more instead of trying to fight against it. That's crucial. So that's what trauma informed care I think is meant to be, and it just in practice doesn't always come out like that. Even though there are attempts to do that, in practice it just doesn't always quite come out in that way, the way it was meant to be. Well, the other side of that too is it's awesome to be aware of people's experiences and factor that into how you treat them. But then once you identify a person has had trauma that has become PTSD, or complex PTSD, then what do you do about it? So giving them the right treatment for that too is the other piece that often doesn't happen, because it doesn't take just skills training, basic skills training, or CBT, or generalized talk therapy, or generalized solution focused therapy. Those things don't work for complex and chronic PTSD type symptoms. There are more specific approaches to working with PTSD and with complex childhood abuse and neglect. There are ways to work with someone with that, and general talk therapy isn't usually it. But you do have to build the trust with someone, and you do have to provide support. But there are just a lot of things that are not in place, not just because of funding, and that is one issue, but it's not just because of funding, it's also because of the beliefs people have and the norms and standards that are set in place, which more often than not tend to blame and project onto the client and the participant. So yeah, that's an issue. And I'm seeing that this is an issue, not just with adult clients in these systems, but also youth. And it might even happen more with youth, where the blame is placed more on them for their mental health symptoms, for their emotional reactions, and the focus being more on punishment and punitive reactions instead of actually helping them work through trauma, helping them work with their families to find solutions, and giving them better skills and tools to use to move forward. And I don't think this happens in a robust way. I think it kind of happens touch and go. Again, partly because of staffing, partly because of funding, but it's not just that. There's a framework, there's a worldview that is nested within these types of organizations. It's a culture, it's a lens, and you can throw more money at it, but the same stuff's going to happen if that lens doesn't change. So yeah, I think that's an important detail that gets overlooked. I don't want to harp on this because, I mean, what does it even mean for me to say this? I've worked in the field I've worked in healthcare for 10 years, mental health for 8 years. Okay, in one sense, big deal. But I've worked mostly as a peer support, and have had my own lived experience with some of these things. I've been through a bit of the child behavioral care system and had traumatic experiences with that. Thankfully, I didn't stay in it, but just what little time I did spend in it was traumatizing enough to, I believe, have a big impact on my development. probably at least equally so to the trauma I was having with my family, with my the environment I was raised in. I'd say the trauma from that short time in the system was at least as traumatic. And that's a big, bold statement. It's hard to say that for sure, but I think as a child, especially as a younger child, there's more vulnerability. And when you're ripped away, even from a volatile environment, or yeah, when you're ripped away from that, that's still your place of comfort. That's still your home, and it's it's cruel, and it is traumatizing to be ripped away from that in a very sudden, institutionalized way, and just dropped into kind of a cold environment, into a clinical setting. Um, Kids do not belong in a clinical setting. It doesn't fucking matter what behaviors they have, unless they've like really actively harmed someone and been violent, um, like a serious threat that that they've actually done. Um, they don't belong in a clinical setting, and that in itself is traumatizing. But then you add in the things that they do, the practices that they do, that are just messed up, like isolation rooms. That's a thing. I experienced it, and somehow it's still happening today. And it might be, just a short time that you're technically in it, but a kid's sense of time is way different from an adult's. So what might seem like a short time, relatively speaking, to an adult, is much longer to a kid. And again, especially you're adding on, they've been ripped from their home and they're in this unknown environment. So that's the new setting. And then on top of that, if they're, you could say, acting out understandably for being scared or uncomfortable or not knowing what to do in that kind of situation, and then punished for that through isolation, that's increasing the trauma. And apparently there's studies that show that this is damaging to kids, and it's still being done. It's still apparently a widespread practice. It happened to me as a kid, and I was hopeful that um, with some of the changes that I know have been happening in the mental health world as a whole, I guess I was hopeful that that was something that was becoming archaic too. And apparently it's not. Apparently it's still being done. And it's primitive. So that's being done, and it's causing harm to kids. And yeah, and then a third layer you add onto this is the kind of support the kids actually get. And they might get some support from professionals, but I can tell you, like, my experience is it wasn't great. I'll just say that. And that's not representative, of course, but knowing the system as long as I've worked in it, um, there are great shining examples, of course. They're not the norm. The norm in this kind of industry is that there is high staff turnover, and there's high staff turnover for a reason. Sometimes that's because they're underpaid. Sometimes that's because they're ill-equipped to deal with the kind of behaviors that they see, which I'll get to that in a minute. And sometimes it's just the extra stress and pressure that's placed on them. with the high staff turnover, I think it does affect the way clients receive new people. I think automatically there's a sense of wariness or lack of trust that has to be really intentionally built. But with this high staff turnover, that's usually a sign of high staff burnout. And when you have high staff burnout, what happens? Your staff are not doing as well as they can. And that's not something to necessarily blame on the staff, because it's the conditions that are set that are causing that. And yes, lack of funding is sometimes a role. It is a role in that, but it's not just lack of funding. It's the way things are done. So just to give you an example, isolation rooms. So if a kid is acting out, and we'll just start by saying that kid is most likely acting out because, well, one, most of the kids who go into those kind of settings come from environments, homes with a lot of trauma. They tend to have high ACEs scores, adverse childhood experience scores. So lots of experiences around being around drug use, domestic violence, being around death and loss, neglect. So the average ACEs scores, these kinds of experiences that kids have going into these types of environments, these homes, these kind of foster care systems, it's at least 4. I'm sorry, it's at least 5. 5 is the average. And anything more than 4 is considered significant. So most people have less than 4. Most kids have less than 4. And that's the general population. Most of the kids who go into these kinds of institutionalized homes, they have at least 5. So we already know they have more than the national average of traumatic experiences and adverse experiences. So they're probably acting out based on that. And the way kids respond to trauma, the way that PTSD shows up for kids is a little different than the way it shows up for adults. I'm not an expert in this. I do encourage people to look this up. But from what I understand, children with PTSD symptoms can express them in less how do I say this? I want to say less direct, but that's not really accurate. An adult with PTSD might experience lots of flashbacks. A child with PTSD, instead of having flashbacks per se, might just have an outburst. They might get angry and become upset and act out. Or they might hide or withdraw. So sometimes what might be considered a kid having a behavioral problem, that is a child's way of expressing PTSD. And for some reason that doesn't seem to be understood, that was not understood when I was a kid. And again, I was hopeful that this may have changed over the years, but I'm extremely doubtful about that now. And it's disappointing, but at the same time, like I said, like even places that call themselves trauma informed, in my experience, they don't really seem to understand what that means. So it's really not that much of a surprise to me that youth facilities don't quite understand this. They should, but they don't. They don't. They seem to not understand this. So, if a kid is having a PTSD response, putting them into a place of isolation, which is just like a practically a bare room that sometimes is locked, that's going to exacerbate the PTSD. That's not going to help the person heal. So the kid is going to come out of that space being further traumatized. And for all we know, some of those kids may have PTSD from neglect, maybe even from isolation. So that very well could be, in some cases, like directly compounding their trauma. But regardless of what the trauma is, it's going to make it worse. It's not going to help. What we do know that helps people, one of the biggest resilience factors for someone who experiences trauma and is able to bounce back and not develop PTSD, or at the very least is able to be more functional, is positive social influence. That's one of the most important resilience factors, which means it's the opposite of isolation. So putting them into isolation is going to compound that trauma. Now, if that's happening, what do you think is going to happen? The behaviors are going to continue, or they're going to get worse. So just from that one factor, and that's not taking other potential factors into account, just from that one possible factor, you're creating an environment that is not facilitating healing and growth. It's causing more damage. So of course it's going to be a harder place to work, because you're actively going against the grain with what works. And it doesn't require, of course, more funding will help, but it doesn't require a huge funding change, I think, to just change the philosophy, to just change the way you approach things. It doesn't cost a lot of money to not send kids into isolation rooms. What can you do instead? You can practice de-escalation, you can practice self-regulation strategies. Actually, even more preemptively than that, you create more of an environment and a space that facilitates healing. And that doesn't always look exactly like clinical practice. So yes, maybe in an ideal world, and maybe not, but maybe in an ideal world, you have therapists who are highly trained, who have specializations in how to work with trauma for kids, and you have family therapists, specialized family therapists on staff who are doing family therapy on a weekly basis. Sure, that would be great. And if there are funding barriers to that, okay, I understand. But you don't necessarily need to do all of that to create more spaces that have a philosophy of healing behind them, because healing isn't just sitting with a clinician once a week. It's great if you can offer that, and places should be able to offer that. If you're not able to choose having a therapist once a week, then that agency is not living up to the standards that they need to support that kind of population. And if it's due to lack of funding, they need to be going to legislature. They need to be advocating on a regular basis and tracking their data to prove and show, like, hey, this is not working. We need funding to do X, Y, Z, because this is what is shown as evidence-based in the field, and according to research, to work. But I question if that's happening. And a lot of places on their websites will say this is evidence-based when it's not. It's evidence-based if they're providing CBT for anxiety and depression. That's evidence-based. It's not evidence-based if that's all they're offering to everyone. It's not evidence-based if someone with PTSD is needing something like prolonged exposure therapy or EMDR, and there's no therapist on site who can offer that. It's not evidence-based if someone um, with borderline personality disorder is just getting DBT informed talk therapy, but they're not able to access full fidelity DBT. So they kind of skirt this idea, but that's getting super in the weeds. I don't want to stay stuck in the weeds. I'm just saying, as an example. But that's even not necessary because a healing environment, because lots of things can be healing and therapeutic without being clinical. Art and creativity are healing and therapeutic. Nature is therapeutic. Peer support, not just formal peer support from a trained, certified person, but peer support from actual peers. That's healing and therapeutic. If you foster the conditions that support those things, those elements, then you're creating more of a space where people can actually heal, and there's less aggression, less violent behaviors, less stuff coming up. And I know that's not an easy process, and it's not a night and day process. It takes time. It's a process to get to that. It takes tweaking, it takes experimenting to get to that place. But it's worth getting to that place. I highly doubt most places are putting in the effort and the time to experiment and keep tweaking things with that as the goal in mind. I think they're just kind of doing it in a very haphazard way. And I'm talking about a whole culture built on that, not just like having a couple groups or having it like a brochure about it. I'm talking about the whole culture with that. And as far as I can tell, fundamentally, the healing, the medicine is community and mutual support. I'll say community and mutual support, and also helping them find their strengths, helping them find, whether it's youth or adults, helping them find what it is that's most important to them, helping them discover that. And then once they discover that, helping them to hone it and pursue it. So those things, I think, are the most important things. And if you don't have the funding, you don't have the staffing to offer all the full clinical practices and all the wraparound support you can do, you can build a culture around that. And there are a lot of, I've seen groups, I've seen communities do this stuff and bootleg it. I've seen them, or bootstrap it, however you want to say it. I've seen them do it with very little funding or with community support, and that's just how you get it done. You just find creative ways to do it. You don't say, oh, we can't really do this here. You have to get that mindset just out of your head and just think about, how can we do this stuff? This stuff is essential. It's not just a side project. It's actually essential, foundational to what we need to offer here. How can we do that? How can we make steps in this direction? How can we fundraise if we need extra money? And how can we bootstrap some of this with very little funding? I'll give another example, like an open mic. As silly and goofy as it sounds, because it's not really socially ingrained in our culture, an open mic where people can present whatever they want to, poetry, music, art, whatever. That doesn't take any funding, really. It doesn't take much funding. If you already have staff who are doing the regular duties, you can set aside time in that day to host an open mic and just get like a $20 microphone or something on Amazon and just set it up. That's like a very simple, actionable thing you can do. And yeah, it's going to be some trial and error to figure out how it works best for that particular group, but you figure it out. You do it one step at a time. You get feedback and you keep tweaking it. until it's where people really want it. Or you have writers groups, or you have meditation groups. Um, there's a general sense of this stuff, I think, in certain residential facilities, having kind of groups like this. But again, I think there's a qualitative difference between having this built into the culture, kind of the DNA of the organization, and having it kind of dropped onto a bedrock that's mostly clinical and bureaucratic. That's a huge difference. And it looks like kind of the same thing on the surface, but it's really not. And I think anyone who's seen both sides of it, like a true community-driven organization versus a bureaucratic one, it's a night and day difference. And yeah, ideally we want these kinds of organizations, I'll just say these kinds of social services, to be community driven, because it's the community that knows best what it needs or is in the best place to get feedback. And it's great to have evidence-based practices and stuff, and certain expertise, but only when it's nested within this base of community foundation, not when it's reversed. Or even worse, when it's in this bureaucratic foundation that's mostly profit-based or just purely bureaucratic. It doesn't work. Systems thinking, that's a separate thing. At its best, bureaucratic thinking is systems thinking. I'll say that. At its best. You need systems thinking for logistics to get things organized, but bureaucratic thinking is kind of its own beast. And it just comes back to what I'm really trying to say here is it just comes back to the services and offerings given to these people who need them, whether it's youth or adults. It needs to be informed by them. It needs to be informed by their feedback, and they need to be an active part of the process. They need to be an active part, and this includes staff too, actually too. They need to be an active part of how the organization is run, its policies, its procedures. They need to be an active part of that. If that's only delivered top down without any feedback from staff or participants or the community, then it's fucked. It's not really serving who needs to be served. And also, it needs to encourage organic stuff to emerge from its participants. It needs to encourage self-efficacy. It needs to encourage self-determination. And those aren't just buzzwords. It needs to actively encourage, like, I'm just say, like with residential facilities. Instead of like a staff person running the groups, it needs to encourage its participants to run their own groups too, to run their own things, to share with each other and work with each other towards common goals. Like one of the best examples I can think of this is it's the Delancey Street Foundation. It was a, well, still is as far as I know, a rehabilitation program that started in San Francisco that was for felons to leave the prison system and reintegrate into the community. And it was offered as an alternative to long-term incarceration. So it was kind of seen as like a transition back into the community. But it offered real rehabilitation. It offered, so when a felon came into this program, often what would happen is they would get mentored by a um, a resident who's been there longer, and that person would just take them under their wing, show them the ropes, tell them how things are done, and there was a system where everyone pitched in. Everyone worked together. They pitched in for the chores and cleaning duties. They supported each other, and again, they had this mentoring component where they mentored each other. They mentored the new people who came in, and then there were projects people could do, work projects, projects to gain real life skills, such as cooking, catering, um, doing landscaping, doing construction work, maintenance work, real life skills, where they got to actually build, you could say, their resume, or build confidence in themselves, or find a trade. And so they were doing these things, like they were learning these new skills in a very organic, real life kind of setting, and they were getting mentored by each other, and then in turn able to mentor newer people who came in. So it was kind of this continuous sort of cycle. And as far as I know, there's been almost no other program that's seen the kind of success rates as the Delancey Street Foundation, because again, it takes felons and it reintroduces them into the community in this transitional kind of way. And yeah, there's been almost no other program that's been able to replicate what this does. And I think a similar model can be applied to mental health, both for adults and for youth. I think, especially in residential settings, but even in a broader sense, in an outpatient sense too. We're kind of halfway there with the idea of peer support as like a formal position, and I think peers can be that bridge. A peer is just someone with lived experience with mental health or with addiction or both, who goes through a formal training, usually like a certification, and works in a sort of entry-level role in social services, working with could be a wide range of people, and their role focuses on building that trust through that lived experience, being sort of like an example of hope that someone who's currently in a crisis or currently going through a lot of stuff, that there's a way out of that, but also to kind of just be someone who holds space for them and who does stuff with them, who just does normal things with them, like playing games or going bowling, or maybe sometimes like going shopping or whatever, just everyday stuff. And peers are in some ways kind of the front line for a lot of people. And they fill in gaps where someone might be only getting like a therapist once a month. A peer is someone who can kind of fill in those gaps where they're not getting those needs met, where they might need to talk to someone, especially someone that they trust, and the peer is able to fill that role. That's important. That's a good bridge, but I'm even talking beyond that, of just natural, organic peer support in the original sense of the word, as like your peers, your community, your people around you. And the Delancey Street Foundation, that's a really great example of that, because that was peer support in action. And it was peer support not by hired staff, it was peer support by people in the program, in turn mentoring new people who came in. So I think that's a great opportunity for even youth in residential facilities to be able to mentor new guys who come in and show them the ropes, and kind of be the person on their side, and giving the new person a chance to one day do that for another person too. I think that is part of the healing process in a way. It gives you a sense of validation. It gives you a sense of, instead of being all consumed by your problems, you're focusing on how you can be a benefit to other people. So it promotes this kind of community contribution mindset. And I think it's equally true. I think it's just as important in adult settings too. So, yeah, those are just a couple examples of ways that you could say the cultural DNA of the way we approach these things can be changed. And the way we've been doing it, it sounds in some ways good on paper and in theory or on a website, but it's not really happening in practice. And it doesn't matter if you throw more money at it, if the worldview is the same things are going to be happening to some extent. And I'm just going to throw this out there too. And again, I can repeat this many times, but this isn't about good intentions or not. There are a lot of people who go into this field with the right intentions, and they can still obviously do good work, but it's almost like you're swimming upstream. It's like if the system and the way things are structured, and this isn't just the broader system, big ass system. This is just even at the organizational level, the way the organization works, how they choose to work. If you're swimming against that, going against the grain of that, it's going to be really hard to do your best and really do what works when the DNA of the organization is against you. And in some cases, even you can do good work, and the best case scenario is the person is happy, or it goes in a beneficial direction, and you're proud of the work that you do, and that does happen, obviously. I noticed that staff in this kind of role, in these kinds of positions, they look for every small win that they can, because there's a recognition like it's hard sometimes to get a win, but it's kind of like you just count every small win that you can, every win that you can, to keep you going. And that's important, and that's not to negate that, but it doesn't, in my opinion, it does not have to be that hard. It doesn't have to be that difficult. And if the way the organization and the system was changed, if it was changed to promote a different kind of culture, you wouldn't be focusing on counting your wins so much. You would just be focusing on what's the most important thing in front of you. And for most people, there's a reason that they get into this field. And getting into some of these, you could say they're quirkier and different ideas of how to do things, it gets more to the heart, I think, of why people get into this field in the first place. And it doesn't matter if it's weird or uncomfortable to make these changes, because the cold hard truth is things right now, they're not working. And it's not just due to lack of funds, and it's not just due to the population that's being served. It's not just due to something inherent with them. It's because the way things are done, it's not working. That's the real reason. So, sure, some things can make things harder, like lack of funding, and you can't save everyone, you can't help everyone. That's true too. But we're talking about big numbers here. We're talking about a lot of people, and a lot of people are not getting the support that they need. So this is the bigger problem. My hope is that organizations can take a look at this there's some bitterness towards this because there's doubt that they will, but my hope is that they will, and that they'll start to empower their staff more. The reason so many staff are unionizing is because they don't feel heard, and they don't feel like they're an active, engaged part of the business. Businesses, agencies, they act in a top-down way, which is traditional and it's normal. It's normal and it doesn't work. If they shifted to more of a bottom-up sort of structure, or at least somewhere in between, they would see less people needing and wanting to unionize. And unionization isn't, I think, the long-term solution, because what we really want isn't to have this union structure where it's still an us versus them within the organization itself. We want the whole organization to be on the same page. And the only way to do that is for agencies, boards, and directors to make their staff an integral part of the decision-making process. And if that's difficult to do, it doesn't matter, because it's worth it. And if they don't do this, they're going to see staff eventually unionize. So if they want to avoid unionization, or if they want to avoid the tensions created from that, this is the way to do it. And maybe for some organizations that involves changing their structure, which I get, that's probably a lot of work. It is a lot of work. But even just doing basic things like having meetings where staff can give feedback, voice concerns, ask questions, and the agency can respond transparently and fully. Like for one example, a very triggering, heated example, talking about budget and talking about pay, staff pay, where staff can ask questions like, why are we getting paid this amount for doing the kind of work that we do? And they can get transparent answers from the directors and executives about why that is. And they can say, well, this is the budget we have, this is why we have this kind of budget. Do you guys have any ideas of ways we can improve our profitability? Getting ideas from staff about that. So having this sort of exchange between people and this transparency and taking ideas seriously. And it doesn't mean every idea is going to work, but I mean, not tokenizing it, but really taking it seriously. And it's just as true in some sense with participants, with clients. Getting feedback from them, taking it seriously, and not just tokenizing it. And then encouraging participants to build their own projects within the ecosystem, and even outside the ecosystem, both. So I think that kind of model works best, and I fully trust people would be happier with that. And, alongside this too, or in the meantime, I think it's also on us to start our own organizations and own movements to do this in grassroots ways.